Why JFK's Vietnam decision terrified Washington. At 11:52 a.m. on the morning of October 11, 1963, President John F. Kennedy sat in the Oval Office holding a document that would end America's involvement in Vietnam. The document was National Security Action Memorandum 263. It wasn't a proposal, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a presidential order. The subject was Vietnam, a country where 16,000 American military advisors were deployed, where American helicopters flew combat missions daily, where American soldiers were dying in a war Kennedy had concluded could not be won. The memorandum stated that 1,000 American military personnel would be withdrawn from Vietnam by the end of 1963, and that the bulk of U.S. personnel would be withdrawn by the end of 1965. Kennedy signed the document and distributed it to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was official policy now. America was getting out of Vietnam. 42 days later, Kennedy was dead. The man who replaced him, Lyndon Johnson, would reverse Kennedy's withdrawal plan within 72 hours of taking office. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops would be fighting in Vietnam. 58,000 Americans would die there. Millions of Vietnamese would perish. The most catastrophic war in American history would consume a generation. And it all began with the reversal of Kennedy's withdrawal order, an order that terrified the most powerful institutions in Washington because it threatened their profits, their power, and their vision of America's role in the world. If you want to understand why Kennedy's decision to leave Vietnam made him a target of the military-industrial complex he warned about, and why that decision may have cost him his life, please hit that like button. It helps us share more suppressed stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Kennedy and Vietnam. The story begins not in 1963, but on May 11, 1961, just 4 months after Kennedy's inauguration. Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 52, approving a plan to send 400 Special Forces troops to South Vietnam to train the South Vietnamese Army. This was a small commitment, advisors only, no combat troops, but it was the beginning. Kennedy had inherited the Vietnam problem from Eisenhower, who had inherited it from Truman, who had inherited it from the French colonial collapse in Indochina. By 1961, Vietnam was divided: Communist North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, anti-communist South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem, and the United States, terrified of communist expansion, was backing Diem with money, weapons, and advisors. Kennedy had Cuba to worry about, Laos, Berlin, the nuclear arms race. But from his first days in office, his military advisors, his intelligence chiefs, and his defense contractors were all pushing him toward deeper involvement in Vietnam. They told Kennedy that South Vietnam was critical to American security. They claimed that if Vietnam fell to communism, all Southeast Asia would follow, the domino theory. They insisted that American credibility was at stake, that backing down would embolden the Soviets and the Chinese, that showing weakness in Vietnam would invite aggression everywhere else. And Kennedy, young and inexperienced in foreign policy, initially accepted their arguments. He increased the number of advisors, he approved helicopter support, he authorized covert operations. By the end of 1961, there were 3,200 American military personnel in Vietnam. By the end of 1962, there were 11,300. By October 1963, there were 16,000. The mission was creeping. Advisors were flying combat missions, special forces were conducting raids, Americans were dying, and the war was unwinnable. Kennedy realized this by late 1962. He read the intelligence reports. He saw that the Diem government was corrupt, unpopular, and incompetent. He understood that the South Vietnamese Army, despite American training and equipment, was losing to the Viet Cong guerrillas.
He recognized that the strategic Hamlet program, designed to isolate peasants from communist influence, was alienating the population and driving them toward the Viet Cong. Kennedy concluded that South Vietnam couldn't be saved, not with advisors, not with air support, not without a full-scale American ground war, and Kennedy was determined to not fight that war. But Kennedy couldn't simply pull out, not in 1962, not with the Bay of Pigs failure fresh in everyone's mind, not with the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrating that he was willing to confront communism, not with the 1964 election approaching and Republicans ready to accuse him of being soft on communism. Kennedy needed political cover. He needed a strategy that would allow withdrawal without looking like defeat. In November 1962, Kennedy received a report from his advisors, including Secretary of Defense Mark McNamara and General Maxwell Taylor. The report was optimistic. It claimed progress was being made in Vietnam. It suggested that with continued support, South Vietnam could achieve self-sufficiency and American troops could begin withdrawing by late 1963. The report was mostly fiction. McNamara and Taylor knew the situation was deteriorating, but they gave Kennedy the cover he needed. They gave him an optimistic assessment that justified a withdrawal plan. Kennedy seized on it. In December 1962, he began privately telling advisors that he wanted out of Vietnam. He told Senator Mike Mansfield that he agreed with Mansfield's assessment that Vietnam was a disaster and that American troops should be withdrawn. But Kennedy said he couldn't do it until after the 1964 election. He said pulling out before re-election would cost him politically, would give Republicans ammunition, would make him look weak. So Kennedy planned a phased withdrawal beginning in late 1963, accelerating after the election, completing by the end of 1965.
This was Kennedy's secret strategy. Pretend to support the war publicly, maintain the advisors, claim progress, but quietly plan withdrawal. Reduce troop levels gradually. Make it look like success, not retreat. And then, after winning re-election in 1964, complete the withdrawal and let South Vietnam collapse without American soldiers dying in a hopeless war. By early 1963, Kennedy was committed to this plan, but he faced enormous opposition. The Pentagon wanted escalation, not withdrawal. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were recommending combat troops, airstrikes against North Vietnam, even the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Defense contractors were making billions from helicopter sales, weapons systems, and support contracts. Intelligence agencies were running covert operations throughout Southeast Asia and didn't want to lose their base of operations. And Kennedy's own advisors, including Vice President Lyndon Johnson, were pushing for deeper commitment. Kennedy resisted them all. In private conversations, Kennedy was blunt. He told Assistant Secretary of State Roger Hilsman that the United States was overcommitted in Southeast Asia. He told Senator Wayne Morse that he agreed the war was wrong, but couldn't say so publicly. He told journalist Charles Bartlett that he planned to pull out after the election, that he'd rather be called a communist appeaser than have American boys die in a war that can't be won. But Kennedy kept these views private. Publicly, he maintained support for South Vietnam. He authorized more advisors. He approved more funding. He met with Diem and pledged American support. Kennedy was playing a double game: public commitment, private withdrawal planning. By mid-1963, the situation in South Vietnam was collapsing. The Diem government was increasingly repressive. Buddhist monks were immolating themselves in protest. The South Vietnamese army was suffering defeats. The Viet Cong controlled large portions of the countryside, and American advisors were reporting that the war could not be won without massive American combat forces. Kennedy made his decision. In May 1963, he ordered McNamara to develop a withdrawal plan. McNamara convened a conference in Honolulu with military commanders and State Department officials.
The result was a plan to withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of 1963 as a first step toward complete withdrawal by the end of 1965. But there was a problem. The Joint Chiefs of Staff opposed withdrawal. General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, argued that withdrawal would lead to South Vietnam's collapse and a strategic disaster. General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, wanted to bomb North Vietnam and mine its harbors. Admiral Harry Felt, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, claimed the war was winnable with more American support. Kennedy overruled them all. On October 2, 1963, McNamara and Taylor returned from a fact-finding mission to Vietnam. They presented their report to Kennedy and the National Security Council. The report acknowledged problems, but claimed sufficient progress had been made to begin withdrawal. McNamara recommended withdrawing 1,000 troops by the end of the year as a first step toward complete withdrawal by the end of 1965. The Joint Chiefs of Staff opposed. Generals Taylor and LeMay argued that withdrawal would lead to South Vietnam's collapse and a strategic disaster. On October 5th, the White House issued a statement announcing that McNamara and Taylor had reported progress in Vietnam and that 1,000 U.S. military personnel could be withdrawn by the end of 1963. The statement carefully avoided calling it a withdrawal. It was described as a reduction based on progress, not a retreat. But that wasn't enough for Kennedy. A public statement could be reversed. Kennedy needed a formal presidential order, a National Security Action Memorandum that would make withdrawal official policy. On October 11, 1963, Kennedy signed NSAM 263. The memorandum stated, "The President approved the military recommendations contained in Section 1B 1 through 3 of the report, but directed that no formal announcement be made of the implementation of plans to withdraw 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963. Additionally, the memorandum referenced the McNamara-Taylor conclusion that the major part of the U.S. military task can be completed by the end of 1965. This was it, official policy. America was leaving Vietnam. 1,000 troops out by December 31, 1963. The bulk of forces out by December 31, 1965. Kennedy had committed to withdrawal in a formal presidential directive. Think about what this meant. Kennedy was ending American involvement in a war that the Pentagon, the CIA, and defense contractors all wanted to escalate. Kennedy was rejecting the advice of his top military commanders. Kennedy was defying the political pressure to show strength against communism. Kennedy was choosing to let South Vietnam fall rather than commit American combat troops. And Kennedy's decision terrified Washington. Not all of Washington, not the public, who didn't know about NSAM 263 because Kennedy kept it classified, but the institutions that profited from war, the bureaucracies that gained power from perpetual conflict, the ideologues who believed America had to fight communism everywhere, they were terrified. Let's talk about who had the most to lose from Kennedy's Vietnam withdrawal. First, the defense contractors. By 1963, Vietnam was already a profitable war. Bell Helicopter was selling hundreds of helicopters to the Army. Lockheed was providing transport aircraft. Weapons manufacturers were supplying M16 rifles, artillery, ammunition. Support contractors were building bases, providing logistics, training troops. These companies were making billions, and Vietnam was just beginning to escalate.
If Kennedy withdrew from Vietnam, those contracts would end, the profits would disappear, the stockholders would be furious, and the executives who ran these companies, men who sat on the boards of the Council on Foreign Relations, who advised presidents, who moved between government and industry, would lose their most lucrative market. These weren't faceless corporations. These were specific people with specific interests, men like Lyndon Johnson's friend George Brown, whose company, Brown and Root, later Halliburton, was already receiving contracts to build infrastructure in South Vietnam. Men like Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's former employer, Ford Motor Company, which was manufacturing military vehicles. Men with direct connections to the White House, to Congress, to the Pentagon. Kennedy's withdrawal order threatened their profits directly, and in 1963, those profits were just beginning. If Vietnam escalated into a full-scale war with hundreds of thousands of American troops, defense contractors would make hundreds of billions. But if Kennedy withdrew, that future disappeared. Second, the Pentagon. The military brass wanted Vietnam for institutional reasons. The Army needed a war to justify its budget, to test its doctrine, to provide combat experience for its officers. The Air Force wanted to demonstrate its strategic bombing capabilities. The Navy wanted to show the value of carrier-based aviation. The Marines wanted to prove they were essential for counterinsurgency. Vietnam was the perfect laboratory, a limited war against a third-world enemy with no risk of Soviet intervention, a war that could be controlled, managed, and used to validate every military service's budget requests, a war that would ensure the Pentagon's relevance in an era of nuclear weapons and missile defense. Kennedy's withdrawal threatened that. If America left Vietnam, the military would have no active war. Budget requests would be harder to justify, promotions would slow, the officer corps would stagnate. The Pentagon needed Vietnam, not to win necessarily, but to fight, to stay relevant, to maintain funding. General Maxwell Taylor, Kennedy's hand-picked chairman of the Joint Chiefs, opposed withdrawal. General Curtis LeMay, who wanted to bomb North Vietnam, opposed withdrawal. Admiral Harry Felt, who commanded Pacific forces, opposed withdrawal. These men weren't corrupt. They genuinely believed withdrawal was wrong. But they also had institutional interests in continuing the war. Third, the CIA. The agency was running extensive covert operations throughout Southeast Asia. In Laos, the CIA was conducting a secret war using Hung tribesmen to fight communist forces. In Thailand, the CIA was training Thai special forces. In South Vietnam, the CIA was running the Strategic Hamlet program, conducting psychological operations and supporting South Vietnamese intelligence services. Vietnam was the CIA's largest operation outside of Cuba. The agency had hundreds of officers in Southeast Asia. They were running agents, collecting intelligence, conducting sabotage, and trying to destabilize North Vietnam. If Kennedy withdrew from South Vietnam, the entire CIA infrastructure in the region would collapse. The CIA had just been humiliated by the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy had fired Director Allen Dulles. Kennedy was reducing the agency's budget and transferring paramilitary operations to the military. If Kennedy also withdrew from Vietnam, the CIA's covert operations mission would be gutted. Fourth, the anti-communist ideologues. These were the people who believed the Cold War was an existential struggle, that communism had to be fought everywhere, that any retreat anywhere encouraged Soviet aggression everywhere. They saw Vietnam as a test of American will. These ideologues included senators like Barry Goldwater, who would run for president in 1964 on a platform of military escalation. They included journalists like Joseph Alsop, who wrote columns demanding American commitment to South Vietnam. They included academics like Walt Rostow, who argued that counterinsurgency could defeat communist movements in the Third World. Kennedy's withdrawal validated the opposite view, that not every conflict was vital to American interests, that some wars couldn't be won, that discretion was sometimes wiser than confrontation. If Kennedy succeeded in withdrawing from Vietnam without catastrophic consequences, the entire Cold War consensus would be challenged. All of these groups, defense contractors, Pentagon brass, CIA officials, anti-communist ideologues, had different reasons for opposing Kennedy's withdrawal, but they all agreed on one thing: Kennedy's policy had to be reversed. And then there was Lyndon Johnson. Vice President Johnson had been sidelined by Kennedy. Johnson was excluded from major decisions. He was given meaningless assignments. He was humiliated by Robert Kennedy, who called him Rufus Cornpone and treated him with contempt. Johnson knew Kennedy was planning to drop him from the 1964 ticket. Johnson knew his political career was ending. But Johnson had close ties to defense contractors, particularly his friend George Brown of Brown and Root.
Johnson had relations with Pentagon officials from his years chairing Senate committees. Johnson believed in confronting communism militarily, and Johnson saw Vietnam as an opportunity. If Johnson became president, he would reverse Kennedy's withdrawal. He would escalate the war. He would give the Pentagon what it wanted. He would give defense contractors their profits. He would prove his toughness to the anti-communist ideologues, and he would build a legacy as a wartime president.
Johnson knew about NSAM 263. As vice president, he received copies of National Security Action Memoranda. He knew Kennedy had ordered withdrawal, and Johnson was preparing to reverse that order the moment he had the power to do so. On October 11, 1963, when Kennedy signed NSAM 263, the die was cast. The Pentagon knew withdrawal was now official policy. Defense contractors knew their Vietnam profits were threatened. The CIA knew its Southeast Asia operations would end. The ideologues knew Kennedy was abandoning the fight against communism. And 42 days later, Kennedy was dead. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Within hours, Lyndon Johnson was president, and within days, Johnson began reversing Kennedy's Vietnam policy. On November 24th, just 2 days after Kennedy's death, Johnson met with Henry Cabot Lodge, the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam. Johnson told Lodge, "I am not going to lose Vietnam. I am not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went." On November 26th, Johnson signed National Security Action Memorandum 273. The memorandum stated that it was U.S. policy to assist the people and government of South Vietnam to win their contest against the externally directed and supported communist conspiracy. NSAM 273 didn't explicitly reverse NSAM 263, but it changed the emphasis. Kennedy's memorandum focused on withdrawal. Johnson's memorandum focused on winning. The shift was subtle but decisive. Over the following months, Johnson quietly abandoned Kennedy's withdrawal plan. The 1,000 troops scheduled to leave by the end of 1963 were reassigned, not withdrawn. New advisors were sent to replace them. By early 1964, troop levels were rising, not falling. In August 1964, Johnson used the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an alleged attack on U.S. destroyers that may never have happened, to obtain congressional authorization for military action. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave Johnson the power to escalate without declaring war. By 1965, Johnson was sending combat troops. By 1966, there were 400,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. By 1968, there were over 500,000. The war Kennedy had ordered to end became the defining catastrophe of a generation. The question conspiracy researchers have asked for 60 years is simple. Did Kennedy's Vietnam withdrawal order contribute to his assassination? There's no smoking gun. There's no document saying, "Kill Kennedy because of Vietnam." But there's a pattern, a timeline, a sequence of events that's difficult to ignore. Kennedy signed NSAM 263 on October 11, 1963, ordering withdrawal from Vietnam. 42 days later, he was dead. Johnson reversed the withdrawal within days of taking office, the escalation exactly as the Pentagon, the CIA, and defense contractors wanted. The people who opposed Kennedy's withdrawal policy all got what they wanted after Kennedy died. The motive was clear. Kennedy's withdrawal threatened billions in defense profits. It threatened the Pentagon's relevance. It threatened the CIA's operations. It threatened the Cold War consensus that justified military spending and intervention. The opportunity existed. Kennedy was traveling to Dallas, a city that hated him, in an open motorcade, despite security concerns. The Dallas police provided minimal protection. The Secret Service made baffling decisions about the route and the positioning of agents. The motorcade slowed to almost nothing in Dealey Plaza, creating a perfect kill zone. The result was predictable. Kennedy died, Johnson took power,
Vietnam escalated, defense contractors made fortunes, the Pentagon got its war, the CIA maintained its operations, and the anti-communist ideologues got their proof that America would fight. Let me be clear, I'm not saying the Pentagon assassinated Kennedy. I'm not saying defense contractors hired Oswald. I'm not claiming Johnson orchestrated the killing. What I am saying is this: Kennedy's Vietnam withdrawal created powerful enemies with strong motives to see him gone. Those enemies had connections to intelligence agencies, to organized crime, to anti-Castro Cubans who hated Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs. Those enemies had the means and the motive. And after Kennedy died, they all benefited.
E. Howard Hunt, a CIA officer involved in the Bay of Pigs, gave a deathbed confession implicating Lyndon Johnson in Kennedy's assassination. Hunt claimed Johnson coordinated with CIA officials and anti-Castro operatives to kill Kennedy. Hunt's son recorded the confession. Is it true? We don't know, but Hunt was there. He worked for the CIA. He knew the people involved, and he said Johnson was central to the plot. Malcolm Wallace, Johnson's personal enforcer who had killed before on Johnson's behalf, may have been in Dealey Plaza that day. A fingerprint matching Wallace's was found in the Texas School Book Depository. Is it definitive? No, but it's suggestive. The military-industrial complex Eisenhower warned about had every reason to eliminate Kennedy. Kennedy threatened their profits, their power, their worldview. And after Kennedy died, they got everything they wanted. Here's what we know for certain. Kennedy ordered withdrawal from Vietnam on October 11, 1963. Johnson reversed that order within days of Kennedy's death. The war that Kennedy wanted to end became America's longest and most catastrophic military conflict. 58,000 Americans died. Millions of Vietnamese died. The war cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and defense contractors, Pentagon brass, and CIA officials all profited. The timing speaks for itself. Kennedy's October 11th withdrawal order wasn't just about Vietnam. It was about presidential authority over the military-industrial complex. It was about whether elected officials control foreign policy or whether permanent bureaucracies and defense contractors control it. Kennedy believed presidents should make those decisions. He believed democratic accountability required civilian control of the military. He believed wars should be fought only when vital national interests were at stake, not to justify budgets or enrich contractors. The Pentagon, the CIA, and defense contractors believed differently. They believed professional military and intelligence officers understood threats better than politicians. They believed fighting communism everywhere was essential to national security. They believed presidents were temporary obstacles to be managed or circumvented. Kennedy challenged that view with NSAM 263. He asserted presidential authority. He ordered withdrawal over military objections. He chose peace over war, even knowing it would cost him politically. And 42 days later, he was dead. After Kennedy, no president seriously challenged the military-industrial complex for decades. Johnson escalated in Vietnam. Nixon continued the war while expanding into Cambodia and Laos. Ford and Carter accepted Pentagon recommendations without serious resistance. Reagan massively increased military spending. The Bush presidents fought wars in Iraq. Obama expanded drone warfare and special operations. It wasn't until Trump, ironically, that a president again tried to withdraw from unwinnable wars. Trump attempted to pull out of Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia, and the Pentagon resisted him exactly as they had resisted Kennedy. Military leaders slow-walked withdrawal orders. Intelligence officials leaked to undermine Trump's decisions. Defense contractors lobbied Congress to block funding cuts. Trump survived his presidency, but his withdrawal plans were largely reversed by Biden, who then faced the catastrophic Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021, 20 years too late, at a cost of trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives.
the lesson Kennedy tried to teach in 1963 remains unlearned. America cannot win every war, fight every insurgency, or nation build everywhere. Some wars cannot be won. Some conflicts aren't worth American lives. And presidents who recognize this face institutional resistance from the forces that profit from perpetual war. Kennedy recognized it in 1963. He ordered withdrawal, and he died before he could complete it. On October 11, 1963, Kennedy signed NSAM 263. Withdrawal from Vietnam begins. November 22, 1963, Kennedy dies. 3 days after that, Johnson reverses course. The war escalates. 58,000 Americans die, and the military-industrial complex wins. The question isn't whether Kennedy died because of Vietnam. The question is who benefited from his death, and the answer is clear. Everyone who opposed his withdrawal. Everyone who profited from war. Everyone who believed America should fight forever. Kennedy chose peace. They chose war. Kennedy ordered withdrawal. They ordered escalation. Kennedy is dead. They won. The wink wasn't just on Air Force One. The wink was in every Pentagon budget that grew after Kennedy's death, every defense contract awarded for Vietnam, every billion spent on a war Kennedy had ordered to end. They winked at each other when Kennedy died because they knew the threat was gone, the war was saved, the profits were secure. And America would fight in Vietnam for another 12 years.